So we have covered everything you need to know about styling fonts. Now going forward, we're going to talk about styling text. In this lesson, we're going to talk about vertical spacing or the vertical rhythm of our text. So I've simplified the code from the previous lessons. Now we only have one H1 heading and one paragraph. We're going to talk about two properties that are used for vertical spacing, margin and line height. Now back to our markup, I'm going to select the H1 and P elements and then duplicate them. So now we have an H1, a paragraph, another H1, and one more paragraph. So here's what we get. Now this text is currently violating the law of proximity. The law of proximity describes how we humans see connections between various objects. So objects that are close to each other are perceived to be related. So back to this example, look at the margin above and below the heading. The margins are exactly the same. So it's not quite clear that this heading is for the paragraph below. This is where we need to apply the law of proximity. So we want to increase the top margin, so this heading gets separated from the paragraph before, and we want to reduce the bottom margin so the heading is closer to the text below. So back to our style sheet, currently we have only two rules, one for the body element, pretty basic, and below that we have another rule for our headings where we set the font family. Now I'm going to define another rule for our H1 elements to set the margin. Now here we're going to supply four values. Remember, top, right, bottom, and left, or turbo. So for top margin, I'm going to use 3 rems. For right margins, I'm going to use 0. And as I told you before, when using 0, we don't need to supply a unit. So just 0. Now for bottom margin, I'm going to use 1 rem. And I'm not going to supply a left margin because the browser is going to pick the right margin. Okay? So let's see what we get. Look, our second heading is perfectly separated from the paragraph before and is now closer to the paragraph after. This is an application of law of proximity. So as a rule of thumb, the top margin should be greater than the bottom margin. Now, why am I using rem here? Because I want the margin to be relative to the font size of the root element. So if the user goes to browser settings and change the default font size to, let's say, very small, look, our margins are still respected. If the user changes the font size to very large, our margins are still respected. So we don't want to use a pixel value. Now, let's change the font size to medium. Good. So this is all about margin. Now the next property we're going to talk about is line height. So for our body element, we have set the font size to 1 rem. Now we're going to set line height to specify the height of our lines. With this property, we can adjust the vertical space between lines. So we can bring the lines closer or farther. A general rule of thumb is to set this to 1.5 times the font size. So our font size is 1 rem, and I'm going to set this to 1.5 rem. Now let's see what we get. So here's the effect of line height. If we increase the line height to, let's say, 2.5, our lines are more separated. Once again, a good benchmark is 1.5, but don't take it as a magic number. Every web page is different. Try different numbers, try 1.4 or 1.6 and see what works best on your web page. So let's go with 1.5. Now there's a problem with this approach. If tomorrow I decide to change the font size to 1.5, let's see what happens. Our lines are now closer. If I change the font size to 2 rems, our layout is completely messed up. So whenever we change the font size, we have to remember to change the line height as well. Now let me show you a trick. If we supply a line height without a unit, this number will be used as a multiplier. So the browser is going to multiply this value by the font size, and as a result, the line height will always look good. So currently our font size is set to 2.5 rems. If we change the font size to 1 rem, our line height is still 1.5 times the font size. So that's all about vertical spacing. Next, we're going to talk about horizontal spacing.